Good afternoon and welcome to the 23rd annual exhibit of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies. We've been discussing this stuff all day, and I must say this is the first opportunity I've had in my 15 years here to discuss live on stage, not power to gas, but power to liquid. It's one of the interesting new concepts. It's old, but it's new in it's being tested, and people are looking at the options. What does it mean if you convert power to liquid? We have a specialist to talk about this field. It's Dr. Robin White, who's group leader at the Institute for Solar Energy Systems at Fraunhofer, and the topic is power to liquid. Please welcome with me Dr. Robin White.
Hi.
Good afternoon, Robin. So, yeah, we need those liquids.
Yeah.
First off, just to get up there, Fraunhofer, could you describe what you people do there?
Yeah, so Fraunhofer Society, or Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, is one of the leading applied research societies. We look at doing applied research as the Fraunhofer Society as a whole to support and develop and innovate with industry and bring innovative ideas and products to the market. At the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems in particular, we look, as the name might suggest, in exploiting solar energy, and this might encompass photovoltaics classically to produce electricity. It might also do with thermal technology, heating, cooling, how we begin to integrate these kind of technologies into the energy system, and where I'm embedded in the division of hydrogen technologies, so converting, for example, solar energy into potential energy carriers such as hydrogen.
Yeah, and that's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Energy carrier, energy storage. We're surrounded here by a number of large electrolysis manufacturers. Most people know that one of the ways of storing large quantities of electrical energy is converting it to hydrogen. Always the issue, what to do with the hydrogen. So why liquefy? And not liquefy in terms of pressurizing hydrogen, let's be clear. Why turn it into something else and then something else?
Yeah, so what we can do, if we take the hydrogen being produced from electrolysis, is convert it, or we can use it as if you like, a chemical reagent in this sense, and convert CO2 coming from point waste emission sources, for example, from a steelwork or from a cement factory or from a biogas plant, and convert it into a liquid. We're quite strong proponents of the product methanol, the hydrogenation of CO2. This reaction of CO2 with hydrogen is pretty well known. It's not something which is so unknown to science. Methanol itself is a very interesting product to industry. It's a well-known industrial commodity platform chemical, so in the region of 80 to 90 million tons per year already. And I guess there's an option, for example, to in turn potentially use methanol as an energy storage molecule in the form of a liquid, so we can in principle get around maybe some of the drawbacks of doing compression of methanol, of hydrogen in the first place, because we can reverse the reaction if we so wish to release hydrogen on demand from methanol.
So most people get the fact that renewable energies are clean. You have hydrogen, it's clean. If you use it in the PEM cell, you get electrical energy back and just dripping water out of the back of your car. It gets complicated from a consumer perspective. All of a sudden you're making a hydrocarbon, but in fact you're drawing the carbon out of existing industrial factories and potentially out of the atmosphere?
So what we're making is the most simplest alcohol possible, okay? Mm-hmm. And we can, as I mentioned, we can use this as a chemical platform. For the chemical industry, this is a well-known product, platform molecule to produce, for example, acetic acid. We can think about making olefins, ethylene and propylene, for example. Then you can go towards plastics, and we can take, as I said, CO2 or CO2 equivalent wastes from point sources that would be in principle otherwise emitted to the atmosphere. So therefore we can make a contribution to reaching CO2 emission reduction targets, for example, in the context of the Energiewende here in Germany.
You just mentioned so many key things here, things I've never heard on the stage before. People do talk about methanization, and then there's methanol. So could you help us to distinguish between the advantages of doing methanol and not simply methanization?
Okay, first to make it maybe a little bit clearer, the methanation or the transformation of CO2 with hydrogen to methanation will play a critical role in the energy transition in Germany, for example. From a chemical point of view, you need 4 molecules of hydrogen to produce methane from CO2. That means you have a 25% more hydrogen demand on a molecular basis. An advantage of that way of the methanation is you have the existing nets, so the natural gas grid is there, available in principle. But when you do hydrogenation of CO2, for example, you need 3 moles or 3 molecules of hydrogen. So you have a slightly reduced hydrogen demand in that context. But there's also a liquid fuel provision network as well available that we can in principle drop in fuels that we can derive from methanol, or even drop in methanol itself into that provision system, so we can supply liquid energy carriers as well as gaseous energy carriers.
This certainly provides an elegant solution to the big problem. We do not have a hydrogen distribution resource available. That's, if you exclude how much you can add, how much hydrogen you can add to the natural grid, really the distribution becomes an issue. So it also deals with a number of other topics. Energy density for hydrogen's lousy. So I suppose you get quantities of energy. But you talk about methanol as a commodity with a whole potential series of applications, chemicals. You mentioned plastics. Are there any other things that make it a viable resource and a commodity?
Yeah, so I mentioned the methanol can be used as a basis, for example, to produce acetic acid. It can be used as a basis to produce small olefins, so propylene, ethylene, which then can be converted into higher hydrocarbons or plastics. For example, you can do methanol to gasoline. Synthesis is well known. ExxonMobil was doing this in the 1980s during the oil crisis. And also you can think about doing new exciting chemistries. So one of the things we're looking at is the production of so-called OMEs, or oxymethylene dimethyl ethers. And this is based on the conversion of methanol through some chemical catalysis and tricks to produce these interesting oxygenates, essentially, which can be viewed and used as diesel substitutes. They're very interesting chemical properties, for example, regarding combustion, as a consequence, essentially, in a very simplistic manner, of having no direct carbon-carbon bond in their structure. They're very good, clean combustion in a conventional diesel engine. You have to just modify the sealings in the diesel engine, for example, to use these fuels. And this dramatically reduces particulate matter emissions, dramatically reduces NOx emissions. And these are all key discussion points within an urban mobility context as well.
This certainly turns the diesel vehicle into not bad news necessarily. Yeah. I find it fascinating. There was a wonderful illustration. There's a great brochure as well over at the booth, which is C58. But this illustration that shows the sort of chain moving from electrolysis, spill-off energy from the energy grid, for example, and the process it takes. And we were discussing this whole process, and you were talking about certain factors that play a role in making this viable, capital expenditures and so on. So if we start with spill-off energy, which people think of as relatively inexpensive because it's being wasted, you have the electrolyzer. Moving down the chain towards the end product, what sort of intricacies and cost factors play a role in creating methanol?
So based on our system, we look at taking renewable energy to power water splitting. The technology that we are in favor at the moment in terms of technology readiness level would be a PEM electrolyzer, which can follow in principle maybe variations in the supply of electricity. Maybe it's more amenable to variations in load, for example, on-off cycle dynamic loading, for example. And that's a question in terms of CapEx, actually, about what kind of hydrogen generation system you want to put in there. So do you want to keep it in constant operation, or do you want to have it in dynamic operation? That makes a large impact on your CapEx in that context. And then you have, if you leave it in constant operation, for example, do you need some sort of buffer? Do you need to store the hydrogen? And if you do that, do you do it under pressure? Do you do it with hydrides, for example? And that's also another consideration. Or do you go directly from the electrolyzer to your methanol synthesis reactor. And then you also have another consideration there, and that's compressing the hydrogen a little bit more from around 30 to 35 bar into the methanol reactor, which is normally in the region of 50 to 70 bar, for example. And then you have your methanol reactor, and that will obviously depend on scale, depend on the conditions that you're using to produce the methanol, and then you need the methanol or distillation section where we separate the methanol from the water, essentially, because that's the side product from the hydrogenation of CO2.
When we pass through all these stages, a lot of people would ask the question, what about the efficiencies? When you think of the kilowatts you put into the system and what sort of end product or asset you get out of the system, and there's various ways of measuring that, but of course it's getting complicated.
It's incredibly complicated depending on how you fix or have variable parameters in that kind of model that I've just described. Yeah. So your choice of electrolysis technology, if you run that in dynamic mode or constant load, for example, if you need the buffer, the compressor, the conditions for the methanol synthesis itself. Yeah. And yeah, it's a very complex. And where do you get the CO2 from as well was something I didn't mention, actually. So that's your carbon source for making the methanol in the first place. Where do you get that from? Do you take it as a waste gas from an industrial process, whether it's cement, or do you take it from a biogas plant? And those have their own individual challenges, whether this is cleaning up the CO2, are there impurities which can impact on the quality of your methanol at the end, or the efficiency of the actual catalysis, the catalyst doing the hydrogenation of CO2 in your methanol synthesis step.
Through this entire value chain, if things are optimal, are we anywhere close to reaching prices that would compete with conventional fossil fuels for various applications?
So for methanol itself, this is the price of methanol from conventional production. This is from steam methane reforming, so the production of syngas and the conversion of syngas into methanol. This at the moment, I can't remember the exact price of the European spot market price, but this is in the region of 250 to 300 euros per metric ton. What we do in our best case scenario is we get into around 500, 550, 600 euros per ton, this kind of ballpark figure. Saying that, if we look back through the price history of methanol at the European spot market, we can see that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we were at a similar value. Yeah, and this is quite variable. As I said, it's totally dependent on the methane price on the market. And this has come down quite significantly in the last year or so, which makes a bit tricky to try and make an economic argument. And maybe we need some more policy instruments that can encourage the, shall we say, green methanol in that context and non-fossil methanol, so that we can get, for example, I don't know, carbon credits or CO2 credits for actually taking CO2, transforming it from, if you like, a liability and transforming it into an asset for the production of products, fuels or chemicals, for example.
You could save the diesel industry by producing diesel fuel that doesn't have fine particle dust.
It's an interesting option, certainly in the urban mobility context, yeah.
In terms of value at the end of that chain, so what is the sort of the highest consumer benefit if you think of the product that you produce? This issue, it sounds complicated, but basically when they produce hydrogen in the north from renewable resources, wind turbines, they ask themselves, okay, what's the highest price for hydrogen you can find? They find that the people who run the buses, they'll pay a good price per kilogram. The industries get it more cheaply. When you're thinking about this system, there has to be some sort of financial viability in order to expand that. So the best case scenario for reaping the financial rewards, where does it lie? Certainly not in competing with fossil fuels alone.
Yeah, it depends really on the market you're looking at. So if you're looking at fuels at the moment, you've got a very, very large volume. And the simple economies of scale that exist in that current marketplace make it a big challenge, I would say. But long term, I think maybe there's some potential for methanol, shall we say CO2, hydrogen, methanol-derived fuels to maybe reach some degree of cost comparity. You can look at different markets. Maybe the derivatives of methanol, for example, I mentioned oxymethylene, dimethyl ether. You can think about other applications which maybe have higher value. So you can think about solvents, for example, these kind of things. Yeah, so there's a lot of debate in the European legislature regarding the replacement of volatile organic compounds, for example, like dichloromethane or dioxane, typical solvents that are used in the pharmaceutical industry. So that gives us potentially a market entry point or a niche that we can promote these power to liquid technologies, and then long term we can think about scaling them up so we can maybe get towards the mobility sector as well.
You are by profession a chemist.
Yeah.
And here we are at a fair that has a lot of tree-hugging reactions. That is, we're always thinking of environmental issues. But you did mention we have to think practically, and you did this brilliantly. In fact, during the preparation, I kept on jaw-dropping because there are certain reflective moments where you consider options that manufacturers with the dream of simply renewable energies don't always consider. But still, when you think of possible policy initiatives, that could be in the expansion of renewable energies. As soon as you have a lot of wind turbines, if you've got gigawatts of energy, you're going to try and harvest that financial value. And then you mentioned already the emissions restrictions. If they change their policies on diesel fuel, but decide to continue manufacturing diesel cars, you have a market. If there's changes in emissions within the cities that affect several vehicles, there's another decision there. So, and then if there's rewards for capping CO2 emissions in general, if you can monetize that CO2, you have another thing. So
This is a very, very important and very significant discussion. I mean, there's a lot of discussion right now regarding modification of the Renewable Energy Directive at the European Union level, for example, to promote, shall we say, carbon capture and utilization technologies, which power to liquid is one. There's also, for example, in Germany, a discussion, what is a producer, what is a consumer? So as soon as you start producing renewable energy yourself and then you start consuming it yourself, for example, there's a different taxation regime which can also impact on your product costs in the end. So this needs to be clarified going forward. So this product producer-consumer dynamic in that context. And also there's the emission trading scheme, also at the European level, which can, in principle, provide a mechanism to encourage the adoption of such power-to-liquid technologies, I think. So.
This also involves rational choices. We can't destroy the industry overnight because we decide to change things. Do you have a list of favorite policies or ideas that would help us to decarbonize the atmosphere, improve the air in cities? It's a big question to throw at a chemist, but...
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned these oxygenates, or oxymethylene dimethyl ethers. I think they're, in terms of mobility, so for example, trucks or transportation, high torque mobility, for example, in an urban context, I think they have an interesting potential, I would say. A reduction of particulate matter, reduction of NOx emissions in an urban mobility context is very important, yeah. I think that, generally speaking, as an overall ambition, if you like, it would be nice if we could have this circular system, yeah? So, in principle, we could take, this is maybe a bit outlandish, some people say this is really a pipe dream, but to be able to take CO2 from the air and then bring that back into the system, so you have a complete, if you like, technical photosynthesis, where you're taking water, you're splitting it into hydrogen, you're taking the CO2, you're producing an alcohol, which is an energy carrier, a platform molecule, for further products, fuels, energy carriers, etc. I think that's a really nice philosophical concept in principle. Obviously, we need to demonstrate the ecological and the economic benefits of doing such. I mean, carbon capture from the air is, or CO2 capture from the air is quite challenging. It's only 400 parts per million, CO2 410. So this makes it very dilute actually, but has a huge impact obviously in our environment. So, but to capture that back is a big significant challenge in terms of capex, opex costs for the end product. And that's why we can look at, for example, point sources. I mentioned biogas, I mentioned steel, I mentioned cement, where you already have, in principle, the potential to access high concentration, high purity CO2 or CO2 equivalents, which we can then use as a basis to produce products with a lower environmental impact, hopefully in a cost-effective manner.
We do have time for one question from the audience, if there is a question. I think people are rarely... and this is also a very genuine comment. I've been here for 14 years. Usually I talk with people who are manufacturers of specific technologies, and what they really want to do is optimize the market value of that, well, sell it, and then optimize the market value. You're agnostic on a lot of these issues because the chemistry works in various ways. Diesel's not bad news for you. If you synthesize it, it has no fine particle emissions. You're capturing the CO2 that's in it in the first place. So, and it's always a revolution in thought because it's far more complicated, and yet it's always been available, these notions, or at least it has for decades. You think differently. differently about these issues. It's been fascinating for me. It's been an eye-opener. I want to remind people not simply to go to the booth and talk to Dr. Robin White, it's D58, but also to keep your eye open for the Handbook of Energy Storage. There's a reason why this man is so knowledgeable. He's writing on it right now. The chapter's come out in 2019.
Yeah.
And it's a chapter on methanol.
Exactly this, power to liquid methanol. And in that context, I'd just like to highlight as well, on the 4th and 5th of June in Freiburg, we're organizing a workshop exactly on this topic, so power to chemicals and power to liquids. So everyone's cordially invited if they would like to attend.
Yeah. So it's a man who knows what he's talking about and is not marketing any specific angle here, but has the expertise. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Robin. Hope to see you back here next year.
Thank you very much.
I've been talking to Dr. Robin White, who's group leader at the Institute for Solar Energy at Fraunhofer. Hope to see you again, and thank you very much for coming. And thank you. With this interview, we conclude our discussions for today. We welcome you all back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. It's starting, and hope you have a pleasant evening. Thank you.